Welcome, everyone. Thank you for coming today. My name is Christina Bain, and I'm the director of the program on human trafficking and modern slavery here at the Kennedy School with the Carr Center. And I want to thank our co-sponsors today, the Balfour Center's Middle East Initiative, and Kristen and Hillary for making this event possible for this panel. So I have the honor of introducing our distinguished panel today, my colleagues and friends from the Carr Center. Sharon Weinblum is a postdoctoral Fulbright scholar and a Belgian-American Education Foundation Fellow at the Carr Center for Human Rights Policy, where she is a part of the program on human trafficking and modern slavery. Sharon's research focuses on Israeli politics and combines different approaches, including discourse theory, critical theories of security, and political theory. Her PhD dissertation, The Management of Security and Democracy in Political Discourse, an analysis of the competing discursive articulations of the security-democracy nexus in the Israeli parliament, analyzed the competing narratives on the tension between security and democracy in parliamentary debates. Her current work focuses on migrant workers and asylum seekers in Israel. Sharon holds a PhD from the University Libre de Bruxelles, where she has been a teaching and research assistant. She also holds a master's in philosophy and international relations and comparative politics from Sciences Po in France. Prior to joining the Carr Center, Sharon was a postdoctoral visiting fellow at SOAS at the University of London. Besides her fellowship at the Carr Center, Sharon is affiliated with the Center for Middle Eastern Studies at Harvard University and with the Civipol at the University Libre de Bruxelles. Next, I want to introduce Leila Asadi. Leila Asadi is an independent scholar who has taught human rights at Nora University, working on family law with a young group of Iranian women activists in Iran, collaborated with the UNESCO Chair for Human Rights, Peace and Democracy of Shahid Beheshti University, and assisted the Association for Protection of Refugee Women and Children to help Afghan and Iraqi refugees residing in Iran. She presented 2 reports on discrimination against women in Iranian educational systems and violence against child girls in the UN Commission of the Status for Women in 2011. She has also taught women's rights in Islam in the University of Mary Washington, and now is a fellow at the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Studies. At the Radcliffe Institute, Leila will continue to research and work on the realization of women's rights as part of the international human rights agenda. Her research focuses on how international mechanisms can work together to achieve gender justice. And finally, I want to introduce Nora Loori. Nora Loori is an ACLS Mellon Dissertation Completion Fellow and a doctoral candidate in political science at Johns Hopkins University. Her work examines how migrant labor impacts the institutional development, regime stability, and political opportunity structures of the Arab Gulf states. Her dissertation on settling state, non-citizen state power and citizenship in the United Arab Emirates was funded by the ZEIT Siftung Settling in Motion Fellowship. She was previously an adjunct faculty member at the Dubai School of Government and a Dubai Initiative Research Fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School's Balfour Center for Science and International Affairs. And I would now like to turn over the program to Nora, who will frame our conversation today.
Thank you. Thank you for that introduction. Can everyone hear me? So what I'd like to do is take just 5 to 7 minutes and bring all the papers together before you listen to them. Tell you about the broader theme of why we put this panel together and why we decided to bring these very different topics together under one event. So for the purposes of this panel, we understand citizenship as the right to have rights. And we're all concerned with 2 central questions. How do you acquire the right to have rights, and how do you lose the right to have rights? I'm going to start with loss, because it's only in the loss of citizenship that we understand it as the right to have rights. And this is a formulation that Hannah Arendt comes up with in 1979 with the origins of totalitarianism in trying to reflect upon the Holocaust and how it emerged. She writes, "We became aware of the existence of a right to have rights and a right to belong to some kind of organized community only when millions emerged who had lost and could not regain those rights. Stateless people could see that the abstract nakedness of being nothing but human was their greatest danger. It seems that a man who is nothing but a man lost the very qualities which make it possible for other people to treat him as a fellow man. The loss of home and political status became identical with expulsion from humanity altogether." we could take someone like Aimé Césaire, who's writing a little bit earlier in 1955, to say that we can't actually exceptionalize Nazi Germany to the degree that it's removed from the broader and sustained patterns of governance that preceded and surrounded it. That is to say, Nazis brought the governance of the colonies to Europe and inflicted it on other Europeans. That's Aimé Césaire's point. He writes, in response to the indignant and surprised reaction by Europeans to Nazi Germany, that they tolerated Nazism before it was inflicted on them, that they absolved it, shut their eyes to it, legitimized it, because until then it had been applied only to non-European peoples. The very distinguished, humanistic, very Christian bourgeois of the 20th century has a Hitler inside him. And I think the broader analytical point is to try to understand what is it about states, not just totalitarian states, but even democratic states, that enables them to preclude certain members of the society from being within the political community, and what's the risk? As a response to these various, as a response to these various colonial legacies and Nazi Germany in particular, the growth of an international human rights regime in the 20th century is centrally concerned with protecting citizenship as a right to have rights. So let's take stock now in the 21st century to see how we're doing, returning to the question, how do we lose the right to have rights? Well, first of all, not everyone has it. There are over 15 million stateless people who are currently stateless around the globe. Some are refugees, but that figure actually is about people who have never left a border or leave the country of their birth. So they've never crossed a border or leave the country of their birth. They are stateless not because they're temporarily displaced, but because structurally they're permanently unrecognized by citizens, as citizens by the jurisdictional authority of the territory in which they reside. So examples include the Baharis in Pakistan, Bangladesh, Rohingya in Burma, Ivorians, Dominicans, and so on, the Roma across Europe, Palestinians across the Middle East, the Bedouin in Kuwait, ethnic Russians. As you can see, it's a global phenomenon. So then once we, leaving aside now people who are structurally stateless from the beginning, people who have rights, how do you lose them? So if we think about denaturalization, there's at least two different, let's say, speeds by which it can happen. A very swift speed, so that's in response to a political crisis, Nazi Germany, Nakba, the Armenian Holocaust, the Armenian genocide, the expulsion of Asians from Africa with decolonization. We have many examples of very swift denaturalization, which happens as a response to a particular political crisis. And then there's the slower, gradual kind of denaturalization that happens with state building. And this takes a little bit more imagination to think about. It's about as states develop, as they have begin standardizing their different identity documents, you have people who get locked out. So let me give you an example of someone who I will talk about in my talk later on, who had a ruler's document as a special guest from 1971. So he's kind of in his own category. In 1971, he can use that document and get goods and services. In the 80s, he can do it. By the 90s, it's more difficult. By 2000, it's impossible. So over time, you slowly lose access to rights. It's a slower denaturalization. It's not. It makes you think about power in a more institutional way, rather than necessarily someone enforcing this violent act upon someone else. And then you can have rights that get revoked because your rights are contingent upon your conduct. Here we can talk about political misconduct or a security breach. Denaturalization under a question of a security breach or treason is something that is possible to do in the U.S. It's possible to. It's a central tactic, for example, in the GCC now for people who are seen as threats to national security. It is within the sovereignty of the state to take away their citizenship. When we're talking. Citizenship regimes are always racialized and they're also always gendered. So sexual misconduct becomes also a way of losing your right to have rights. And this is where Leila's paper comes in. With a perceived sexual misconduct or a rape victim or a divorced woman, in a Sharia context, you have women's access to rights becomes contingent upon having, upon being perceived of withholding a certain kind of conduct. And if they lose that, then it depends on really their family links. So if they have family support, then they're not vulnerable. But if they lose that family support, those are the women who then become vulnerable to being trafficked. So it makes you, that's why we included this paper to think about even forms of sexual misconduct as being a way of becoming denaturalized effectively. Moving on to naturalizations. So how do you acquire the right to have rights? I put my timer on and it didn't work, so someone just let me know how I'm doing on time. Naturalization also occurs at different speeds for different people, even within the same legal context. So we often think about jus soli regimes or jus sanguini regimes. Jus soli is citizenship by birth, jus sanguini is citizenship by blood. And actually, the dominant scholarship that talks about jus sanguini and jus soli often puts jus soli regimes as being necessarily more inclusive, and jus sanguini regimes as being necessarily more exclusionary. But historically, it's shifted. Jus soli is now kind of associated with the British system, more of the French system, jus sanguini with the German system. But actually, it was France who first implemented the jus sanguini citizenship regime after the French Revolution. And it was seen as a break from the feudal order where your worth is determined by where you were born. Instead, your worth is determined by your blood. So you are a citizen in your own right. So these ideas kind of shift, and we have to think about, instead of making ideal types, think about how governments use a particular citizenship regime in response to specific populations, right? Strategic. Again, you can get naturalization very swiftly. So you have targeted immigration programs. Of course, one that we'll think about is the Israeli case, where you have Jewish immigration is very different from other forms of immigration in Israel. But you have other forms in the 20th century and before of targeted immigration programs, racial whitening in Brazil, for example, quota systems in the United States. Well, and even when you don't have a specific kind of citizenship regime that encourages people to come, you can get citizenship very swiftly, for example, in the UAE context, by having the right connections. So if it's by sovereign decree, it's swift. If it's not by sovereign decree, it can take decades and generations. And then when we're also thinking about gradual or irregular routes to citizenship, it's really important to think about racial naturalization. By this I mean we have to challenge straight-line assimilation theory that comes from that assumes that naturalization is similar just because it is a legal process. So here I take a quote by legal scholar Devin Cardova, who writes that it was only in his encounter, and he's a black British scholar, I should say, and it was only in his encounter with the LAPD that he became American. He wrote, "I became American long before I acquired citizenship. Unlike citizenship, black racial naturalization was always available to me, even as I tried to make myself unavailable for that particular Americanization process." So immigrants and new citizens are not exempt from the extant population categories, the extant racial dynamics of a receiving society, even if they do not identify with the minorities that they are grouped with. For example, due to the lobbying efforts of first wave of Arab migrants in the United States, especially from Syria and Lebanon, Arabs are categorized officially as white in the U.S. Census. For those of you who have to take those census forms, know this. However, especially in the aftermath of 9/11, Arabs in America, ranging from assimilated Christian Arab immigrants to temporary international students, face the kind of targeted, racialized, and gendered scrutiny that blacks and other non-whites are well acquainted with. The surveillance of visually marked populations, the association of certain bodies with violence and threats to national security, in short, racial profiling, has a long history as a mode of governance in the United States, and new migrants are interpolated into that history. So the point of this panel is to think about domestic racial politics and new migrants as part of the same kind of broader contours of the state. Again, internal minorities or domestic racial politics, labor migration, asylum-seeking refugees, and human trafficking are distinct issues that have to be dealt with separately in order to be analyzed sharply. But if we think, part of why we chose these cases was to choose cases and use them differently than they've typically been used. So in my case, or let's start with Sharon's case. Sharon talks about Israel, a case that is normally talked about from the perspective of internal minorities, to think about how the Palestinian question actually also impacts non-Palestinian asylum seekers coming in. So how domestic politics impacts new migration. I look at a case that's normally talked about from the perspective of labor migration, the United Arab Emirates, where 96% of the labor force is made up of non-citizens, to look at the people who are not guest workers and not citizens, but those who are caught in between. So I look at how a system that is designed around regulating labor migration also concretely impacts internal minorities. Finally, in the Iran case, for those familiar with the Middle East, you'll know that human trafficking and prostitution in the Gulf, Iranian women are highly represented among the people who are trafficked within the region. So what happens domestically? What's going on that makes particular groups of women vulnerable to being trafficked, vulnerable to losing their rights? So that's to frame the panel for you, and I'll just get right into my presentation briefly, which is on offshore citizenship. So today I'm going to talk to you about how political elites in the United Arab Emirates adopted a market solution to deal with a common dilemma that every modern state has to face at some point. What should be done when the parameters for citizenship, that means the legal boundaries for inclusion in a polity, are more narrowly defined than the actual reality of the diverse populations who reside in that territory? In other words, what should be done about internal minorities who do not fit into the way the citizenry is defined? Governments have three options when it comes to regulating these internal others: incorporate, expel, or ignore. The expel option and the ignore option are seen as increasingly unsustainable in a current global context of national security, in which undocumented populations are understood to pose a threat. In the 21st century, national security systems are adapting to increasingly focus their attention on non-state networks and individuals. Central to this turn in international security has been a push for greater coordination and standardization of identity documents. Increasingly, international security is not only about controlling identity at borders, but also internally within the domestic arena of goods and services. Population legibility, as I call it, that is, the ability to document, track, and count everyone in a territory, has become a central preoccupation of policy debates on a global scale, that is especially important in the United Arab Emirates, which is a major global hub separating Europe on the west on one side and the Indian subcontinent, Pakistan, India, Afghanistan, the rest of the Middle East on the other side. Security forces of the UAE play a key role in the global war on terror, and if we're worried about non-state threats, then it's no longer sustainable to have pockets of unassimilated or unincorporated populations. Moreover, and more importantly, the dominant literature suggests that market liberalization comes hand in hand with a loss of sovereignty in the domain of citizenship. Scholars argue that as domestic markets and institutions are more embedded in international processes, especially labor migration, states inevitably have to liberalize their citizenship regimes to align with international norms. And there's some proof of this. We can observe that even citizenship regimes that have typically been associated with a very stringent set of ethno-national criteria, like Japan or Germany, have had been forced to liberalize and become more inclusive. But does economic liberalization specifically and the deepening of international ties necessarily lead to the liberalization of citizenship regimes or erode state sovereignty in this domain? I argue that it does not. And I use this case study of the UAE to show how state actors can actually use market solutions to increase sovereignty over the domain of citizenship and make the criteria more restrictive rather than more liberal using international ties. So what is offshore citizenship? It's an informal bilateral agreement in which one state issues national passports to stateless people in a different state. So this arrangement was not adopted to foster the emigration of stateless populations. Quite the contrary. The passport issuing state explicitly prohibits the relocation of passports recipients to its territory. So this is very abstract, but basically in 2008, there was an agreement between the Federal Ministry of Interior in Abu Dhabi and the Comoros, the presidency of the Comoros Islands, facilitated through a private company called the Comoros Gulf Holding Group that basically printed passports for stateless people in the UAE. So they effectively they went from being stateless or partially naturalized, and I'll explain that in a second, to becoming guest workers. They changed their legal status. Their nationality changed, but they have no connections to the Comoros Islands. And in many cases, their names were often changed because the spelling was different to make it more francophone. So you have a group of people who've been in the country for many years who are undergoing the naturalization process, and in the midst of a standardization drive where the government is trying to make sure that everyone gets documented, it has to deal with this population because it can't just leave them undocumented. So instead of liberalizing and including this population, the state uses a private company and a market solution to give them nominally a citizenship that is not connected to residency in the Comoros Islands at all. And in fact, if you look at the debates within the Comoros Islands Parliament, it's very clear that the passport holders are not allowed to reside in the country. Moreover, they're officially then guest workers in the UAE. So they have temporary employment visas that have to be renewed. And for some people in this population, they're reaching their 60s, so they're over the retirement age. So this is a pressing concern because they don't really know what's going to happen as they continue to try to renew their visas. Let's meet one of them. Let me just go back to an analytical point. So offshore citizenship basically produces a new option for the state. In addition to incorporate, expel, or ignore, this policy solution enables the government to actually turn people into foreign residents. How and why does something like this happen? This happens specifically because of the structure of the federal system, where one way to think about naturalizations is as a kind of demographic apportioning. So in a federal system, same as the U.S. Census or redistricting questions, who has the right to include someone as a citizen is a major issue in sovereignty over state versus federal rights. So when you actually look at who empirically gets these passports, it's all people who've been approved at the emirate level, at different emirate levels, non-Abu Dhabi Emirates, but not at the federal level. So they're actually mired in between, they're in this kind of gray zone, not only just between citizens and non-citizens, but they're also stuck between levels of a federal state. And actually, it's less about them. It's more of a power struggle between the different emirates, and the federal government. And the reason this happens in 2008 is because the death of Sheikh Zayed in 2004 creates a shift in elite politics and a broader kind of standardization of not just identity documents, but also many of these people who were in between categories because they're not guest workers, were being handled by different offices, the ruler's office, etc. And a lot of these offices at this point get shut down because their expenditures are too high. So this is a general drive to standardize the entire system. So who does it impact? That you have internal minorities, people who were born in the country to parents who cannot trace their lineage back to 1925. And these are the contemporary artifacts of older systems of rule and trade, including merchant networks, former slave, pearl divers, Persians, etc. And you also have a separate group of refugees. So officially, there's no category of refugees, but there are people who have entered the country as refugees. This includes Somalis, Iraqis, Palestinians, Zanzibaris, and Ugandans. And I look specifically at the Ugandan refugees who, let's meet one of them. Abdurrahman Bilal, age 66. He's been denaturalized twice in his life. Once very swiftly, and then once very gradually. He was born in the capital of Uganda in 1946. Then in 1972, Idi Amin came into power and expelled the Asian Ugandans. The Red Cross started handing out, I should say that he's a Belushi descent. So the Belushis don't really have their own country, but they're a minority who can be found Afghanistan, Pakistan, Iran. And a lot of them were mercenaries in the Omani Empire. That's how they ended up in East Africa. That's how he ended up. His we're talking 3 generations out, ended up in East Africa. The Red Cross started handing out documents in 1972, and Abdurrahman was in transit in Italy, where he had a few options of where to go, and the UNHCR took him along with his family and others from this group in Uganda to the UAE. So you had 2 groups. One went to Abu Dhabi, one went to Dubai. So the Dubai group now have the Comoros Islands passports. The Abu Dhabi group have been resettled outside. That's why I could get Abdurrahman on the record, and I actually recorded an interview with him, and I realized, unfortunately, it didn't play, but I can try later if we have time. So this is, just to show you, this was the ruler document. This is an example of a ruler's document earlier on. That, as you can see, it's not a passport. It's a special category, a special guest. You can use this document to get access to, at the time, accommodation, healthcare, schooling, employment in the army, as civilians or in police forces. And there are some differences between the Dubai group and the Abu Dhabi group, which I'm happy to talk about. That's a first phase from the 70s until the 90s. By the 1990s, it becomes increasingly unsustainable to have these kinds of documents. And a lot of the current Comoros Islands passport holders received Emirati passports. So when you move now to 2004, a lot of them were actually denaturalized. They had passports. And once they expired, they went to renew them and then never got them back. Instead, they were called in sometimes a few weeks, sometimes a few years later, and given a new passport, which is the Comoros Islands passport. So I'm going to stop there. I just wanted to share this with you. Thank you.
Yeah. I would like to, firstly, I would like to thank Carr Center and Middle East Initiative for having us and giving this opportunity to us to talk about our countries. So for the first time, for the introduction, as an activist that I was working in the field, I have lots of stories to talk. As Nora told, analyze the situation in Iran and just in the 3 countries, and I would like to bring the stories that I have heard from some women that were victims of structural violence, and the story shows like how women were victim by their legal structure and discriminatory law. And I was listening 2 weeks ago to an interview, female interviewed by Omid Foundation. Omid Foundation is a non-profit organization that's working in Iran and shelters teenage girls who are victims of domestic violence. And so the girl interviewed was 15 years old, and she forced to prostitution by her father. Her father was drug addicted, and she ended up in prostitution when she was 13. And she was arrested by the government 3 times, and in the 3rd times she received 350 lashes by the court. And so it was shocking for me that I heard that. sent to the jail, and she was in prison for 6 months. And after she released, one of the women activists sent her to the shelter. So I know that this is an extreme case of prostitutes in Iran, but I think it kind of shows that how in this extreme situation, hard situation, they are working. And so in my paper, I want to focus on the political ideology. So in the recent years, I have to say that both official and unofficial evidence suggests that Iran, like other countries, is experiencing an increase in prostitution and the trafficking of women. Young Iranian girls and women are trafficked to Pakistan, Turkey, Europe, and Arab countries, especially the United Arab Emirates, for forced labor and prostitution. That in Iranian women, if you have experienced that, Iranian women in Dubai are most visible prostitutes. And my work has focused on more on Iranian women in Dubai. And sex trafficking of Iranian women or women in Iran is the result of a number of causes, including discriminatory legal structure and policies. And I have argued in my paper that Iran's legal structure disenfranchises women from equal rights, and policies advocate the subjugation of women, which indirectly makes them vulnerable to prostitution and sex trafficking. Depicting a picture of political and religious perspective pertaining to prostitution and illicit sex, I strive to demonstrate how ideological approach, lack of supportive legislation, and the criminalization of prostitution are detrimental to victims of sex trafficking. First, in prostitution, from a religious perspective, sexual desire in Iran is not censored, and generally is not censored in Islam, and it's different view than Christianity. And so, but it should be directed toward a pre-designed social order. Therefore, in an order based on Islam, the divine guidelines of Quran and Sunnah rule over all public and private areas of Muslim life and directs Muslims to move toward piety and faithfulness. To be pious, human impulses, including sexual desires, should be behaved according to divine regulations. Thus, marriage, either monogamous or polygamous, is the only acceptable context for intercourse, and all other kinds of sex, such as prostitution, endangers the pre-designed sexual order. Then it's not surprising that prostitution is taboo in Iran, as an Islamic country run by Sharia law. Illicit sex and prostitution as forbidden sex, haram, we say haram and we say the word in Arabic, jeopardize men's devotion to God and the sanctity of family as a core institution of society that helps men to bring forth legitimate children, halal zadeh, and keep their Muslim descendants alive and productive. Dividing the sexual behavior of citizens into haram and halal acts as a criteria for religion to measure how people adhere to it. And in terms of political ideology, prostitution endangers the government's propaganda about living in an ideal Muslim country. After the Islamic Revolution in 1979, revolutionary and religious bodies formally strive to assert that sexual relations outside of marriage are not only illegal or haram, but contradict the government's scheme for Islamic social and political reforms. Unrestrained sexual relations were seen as characteristics of Western colonial capitalist civilization. And so prostitutes were executed by the Islamic Revolutionary Committees, Fiat, led by clerics committees, where these committees were established as the first official institution to protect people's lives and property. Although the main duty of the committees was to identify sabotage against the government, but gradually their agenda was broadened to include social control. And 1 month before the victory of the revolution in December 1979, that changed Iranian political system, the new regime's tendency toward ideological upheaval was reflected in an outrageous attack on Sharon. Sharon was a place official place for brothels that was established before the revolution by the Shah. And the first symbol of Islamic revolution was echoed in attack to Sharon and by the revolutionary groups hoping to destroy all the symbol of Shah's regime. I want to say a brief, short history of this attack. Around 5 o'clock in the afternoon, people gathered outside Sharon, the place. Very soon, the gathering turned into a protest, and people screamed religious chants. Police officers asked people to leave the neighborhood, but they refused. Even firing into the air was useless. Several young revolutionaries attacked to the door, and crowd followed them into the streets of Sharon. Houses and shops inside the neighborhood were set on fire, and some demonstrators tried to stop them, but the outraged crowd took the prostitutes and beat them. Several witnesses stated that 2 or 3 of prostitutes were killed and many were wounded. The big city brothel was set on fire for hours while firefighters refused to tend the fires because they had already declared that they would join to the protest. And so 6 months later, in July 1980, Sharon was shut down forever by the Islamic Committee, and 3 female pimps were executed by the Islamic Revolution Court, and other prostitutes were punished harshly by imprisonment or lashes of them. And gradually, the repression of illegal sex by the government's political and religious agendas created a cycle in which adherent people not only reinforced Islamic values, but more importantly, intensified the government's power based on an Islamic agenda. In this cycle, any infringement of law dismantles the efficacy of an ideal Islamic state. Thus, the increase in prostitution and even its visibility increased citizens' distrust of the effectiveness of the religious state and caused the government to fear the disobedience of its citizens. By introducing policies such as dress code, moral patrol units, and militia groups passage, soon after the revolution, the government monitored the implementation of Sharia law. The patrol units, and later passage, they are particularly sensitive to drinking alcohol and clothing, prostitution, and illegal sexual relations. So it was the policy of the government that showed that how the government looked, considered women. And the outbreak of war between Iran and Iraq, the first phase, stopped attention to sexual activities and related discussions because the war was viewed as heroic and holy for Iranians. The country was fully mobilized, and most men and women, young boys were armed. The dominant atmosphere influenced by the holy war encouraged spiritual activities such as eagerness to die and be martyred for God, and hided every discussion and activity based on a materialistic view of life, including sexual relations. And after the war, reconstruction period gave an opportunity to people to get back to their normal lives. The new government started to rebuild the country, change its foreign policies, develop the education system, and relatively liberalize society. Very soon, the economic and social consequences of war started to be discussed publicly. So, in this condition, the arrest of a war widow for prostitution awakened the society toward an unknown previously phenomenon. A woman had engaged in prostitution as a last resort to feed a family. This woman was the widow of a murderer. Some people who had killed in the war. And so 38 women, and after 38 women were arrested. Most of the arrested women said during interrogation that they had ended up to prostitution as a result of poverty. So the inadequacy of religious restrictions and government policy was apparent since prostitutes and drug dealers again had begun to work while government insisted on criminal approach toward the illegal sex and prostitution. Now, because of the harsh penalties, prostitution continued underground, and it is in fact negated all the official endeavors to control the public and private lives of citizens and associated with other crimes such as drug dealing. The new form of prostitution enables gang groups to support and protect sex workers from clients' harassment, as well as providing a safe market in which to operate. Call girls and online prostitutes also conduct their activities in a safer environment. They found their clients without any fear of being arrested in the street or working under pimps' control. I wanted to say that whatever the government tried to mainstream the political ideology, Islamic ideology, on the other hand, people, women, because of for some reason, for any reason, for poverty or any kind of other reason, because the result was underground prostitution, definitely. And in the recent years, online prostitution is so common. And so, interviewing with prostitution, sex trafficking also challenges the political and religious ideology in many Muslim countries, and Iran is one of them. According to U.S. State Department report on sex trafficking, among 70 countries that were given three licenses reserved for divorce offenders, nine countries are Muslim countries, and Iran is one of the countries that do not comply with international standards regarding to sex trafficking victims. And many of Muslim families, in my research, I found that most of Muslim population becomes involved with sex trafficking due to economic instability, low standards of living, inadequate laws, and social policies, where Muslim policy makers usually prefer to use oppressive strategies to control citizens spiritually. It seems that sex trafficking is perceived as a disturbance to Muslim society and politics, and looked as anti-Muslim because it disrupts domestic sex segregation and infringes on both spiritual and physical borders. The geographical boundaries in the Muslim countries might be perceived as a difference between a pious and non-pious Muslim society, or a Muslim and non-Muslim order, in which Muslim women even cannot marry to people of religious minorities. Crossing the borders, voluntary or involuntarily, women who are treated as others by an androcentric social and political order in a Muslim society deny the control of government over those borders. And breaking the laws, trafficked women get involved in a haram business while having intercourse with others. They are others, and they have intercourse with others as non-Muslims, and this intercourse doubles their disobedience. Therefore, sex workers compromise the ideal Muslim woman and offer a defeated vision of Muslims whose honor is under the control of others. This approach leads to some strategies by the governments to deal with the problem, which I explain later. In Iran, the most recent data on sex trafficking gathered around 2002-2003 and admitted that sex trafficking exists. A very conservative newspaper disclosed the arrest of a woman by police who headed a ring that transported girls from Tehran to Dubai and for prostitution in biscuits and bar. Right now, you can find, if you go to Dubai, you can find many Iranian girls that they're working in nightclubs and bars and in the street. And some of them are very high-ended, high-class demand prostitutes in Dubai. And some of them I heard that some of them, they earn money for $3,000 per night. Based on studies conducted on women's trafficking in Iran, sex trafficking in Iran has two main rules. One is just sex trafficking of women to Pakistan, and they are working in Kharabat and brothels. And most of them are from very marginalized and poor regions in Iran, in south part of Iran, in Pakistan, and in the west part of Iran, in east part of Iran, Khorasan. And the other group are more belong to middle class. And so they are trafficked voluntary or involuntary to Dubai. And so after when sex trafficking came to the fore in 2003, the Iranian government started to take some policies in reaction to the problem. And first policies, sex workers were marginalized and stigmatized. That it was continued, and authorities denied their existence. Then the government response is widespread misinformation. It's kind of misinformation or refusal to verify information. Just for a short period, when Khatami was president, and in the reformist era, medias and newspapers would talk about the problem and sex trafficking and prostitution. And after that, in 2004, everything was banned, and the media was banned to talk about it. And within the second strategy, violators are arrested, imprisoned, or executed indiscriminately. For example, all members of trafficking ring in which women were trafficked to Pakistan were arrested and punished in 2004 by a court in Mashhad to imprisonment, flogging, fines and exile. And blaming the Western culture. And through the actions and discourse of the government, although women are seen as guilty of violating the laws and should be punished, they are considered also as victims of a Western lifestyle. And the lack of enough understanding of religious values to practice them. This perspective is adopted to fight problems with the Muslim society. Therefore, any kind of lifestyle outside of visible and invisible borders of a political Islam is considered as Western invasion meant to destroy Muslim families and societies. And right now, 3 months ago, Ahmadinejad cabinet drafted a law to limit the right of women to travel outside the country. And so the main idea of the main article of this draft says that women who are single and they are below the 40, they are not permitted to leave the country without the permission of their father or grandfather or the court. So it was, and then when Women's Rights Act objected, and human rights lawyer, women's rights lawyer objected to the government why about this draft, the government said that officially it said that we have heard that many cases of trafficking, sex trafficking and prostitution, and Iranian women who are going out of the country, that they are entered into the prostitution. And so because instead of protection of women, instead of considering the women's situation in other domestic violence and in legal structure, and instead of creating and establishing a laws and a framework to which is more equal, they started to deny or just limit women, just limit the rights of women. So in the legal structure, I wanted to point out 2 of the articles in civil code that affect the unbalanced power between men and women in the family and the society. First is early marriage. In Iran, based on the civil code, the age of marriage is 30, and so it's legalized. And women, if a girl wants to marry, the only person who has a right to get the permission is father or grandfather. If not, if the girl wants to marry and the father or the grandfather are not agree that the girl can go to the court and take the permission. But the problem is that the age of marriage is 30, and sometimes that the girls cannot decide, and they are not adult. And so, since the father or grandfather must give the permission for the marriage of an unmarried girl, and a child who has not attained the age of legal competence is not capable of resisting the decision, the law creates a condition in which forced marriage is encouraged. And a substantial portion of the street children, and in particular runaway girls, are said to be girls who have fled from the forced marriage and later become involved in prostitution and the sex trafficking. A huge number of the victims of sex trafficking are run figures. They run their home because of forced marriage, because of domestic violence, and they are good bait for traffickers to take out the country. And so the second article in Civil Code is about temporary marriage, and temporary marriage is the most controversial Islamic rule in Iran. And it's a contract between a man and unmarried woman who might be a virgin, divorced, or widowed. The marriage exists for a specific period of time, and dowry or mat. The period of time and the amount of money exchanged must be indicated very clearly. To make the contract binding, the man recites an Arabic verse and indicating that the woman has his wife and she accepts the proposal. Then the parties enter into a short-term marriage that can last from 1 hour to 99 years. The registration of the contract is not mandatory and it depends on the will of each party. If, some of you know that you're Muslim, you know that there is a big difference, big fight between Sunni and Shias about this temporary marriage. And Shia groups, Shia leaders, Shia Muslim leaders, they accept this as yeah, and the basic idea for supporting the muta is the necessity of providing sexual services for men who are away from their families due to jobs or any other special circumstances to prevent them from getting involved in illegal sexual relations. And it is contradictory since Shia jurists, some of Shia jurists says that muta is a solution as an effective tool to combat prostitution and save you from any immoral lifestyle. As I said that before, that in Islam and with a political idea, just the government wants to limit the sexual relation in the order that government said. And so, feminists and socialists believe that muta is per se is an Islamic institution to cover prostitution, in which betrayal or unfaithfulness in a marital relationship is transformed into a legal and legitimate activity. So, in conclusion, I would like to say that under the Islamic regime, there is a systematic patriarchy in which discriminatory laws and policies disenfranchise women and create a vulnerable situation for them in the family and society. And in relating to muta, I would say that many of prostitutes are using muta, and because if police raided to a brothel or just if police raided to a house and find a woman and man are not in legal relationships, and they can see that we are muta, we are sila. And so it's kind of way for taking advantage for men, and also as well as for women who are in prostitution. And muta just it gives a more room to men to take advantage. And so in this unbalanced power construct, temporary marriage as a facade of prostitution makes women available as sexual objects for men to take advantage. And last but not least, the Islamic penal code punishes non-married sex, including prostitution, very harshly. Every prostitute, if she arrested by the government, she receives 18 lashes. And in the first time, she received 80 lashes. In the second time, usually again, she received lashes. And in the third times, she might be sent to the jail. And we have sort of very extreme case that I wrote here. One girl that Atif Rajavi, it was about 2004, that she was arrested after 4 times, and she punished by death, and because of prostitution. And the other girl, Leila, she was forced to prostitution, and she was raped when she was 10. She was 10 years old, and by her brothers, and she was forced to prostitution. And after she was punished by lashes, and again she was punished by death for the 4 times. Thank you.
Thank you. Can you hear me well? Like this? Yeah. Okay. So my papers the paper that I'm going to present is really just a small part in contrast to Leila's work or Nora's work, which is her dissertation. This is really the first step of a broader work. It's I'm starting, as Christina said, a new work on asylum seekers, but also on migrant workers in Israel. And here I'm only focusing on asylum seekers and especially on the political discourse on asylum seekers. But my project is broader and will include political discourse on migrant workers, but also practices. So I'll be happy, of course, to have all the feedbacks of those who are expert on the issue or not expert on the issue, but still have something to bring. So I was interested in the question of asylum seekers in Israel because, as you know, Israel, and as Nora mentioned, is a very specific case of a country regime defining itself as Jewish and democratic, but being mostly a regime of citizenship that is based on jus sanguinis and that promotes, the Jewish people, not only in law but also in practices, despite having a 20% minority that is not Jewish. So I was interested. I have been working on the relation between Jews and Palestinian minority in Israel, but I was this time interested more in the relation between these asylum seekers that arrived in Israel after 2006 and mostly came from Africa, Christian and Muslim populations. So the question was how did the authorities react first? So very clearly, if we take the typology of Nora, it was not incorporation that was the logic. It was more between expelling and ignoring the first logic that was actually implemented in Israel. So there is no individual procedure to treat the case of asylum seekers in Israel, usually, in most cases. And for a long time, asylum seekers from Eritrea and Sudan were granted group protection. Last summer, these groups were actually deprived from this group protection, and now they're being expelled. At least the government is trying to expel them. So this, along with the construction of a wall that's being built in Egypt, at the border with Egypt, and with the amendment of a law last year that criminalizes actually the crossing of the Egyptian border and put in jail any person crossing the border for at least 3 years, shows, of course, that incorporation is not the norm in Israel in relation with asylum seekers. But what I was more interested in was the discourse, the justification for such policies, and whether or not there are actually discordance, if there are competing discourses, and what impact it has overall on the identity of the state and the definition of the regime in Israel. So my findings were based basically on political debates in the parliament, the Israeli parliament, the Knesset, but also on public speeches by political leaders. So I only analyzed political actors, not NGOs, which all have actually a different discourse. So what I found out was basically that there are two broad discourses that I will present, and that none of this discourse actually changed or altered the definition of the State of Israel as being the state of the Jewish people, and I will show how. So the first discourse, which I call the dominant discourse, is basically the discourse that is articulated by the dominant political actors, so the government, but also the majority of the member of the Knesset that support the current policies, that are part or not part of the coalition. It is a discourse that I call the discourse of threat, which is articulated in 4 dimensions, 4 ways. The first dimension is probably the one that is the most felt when you go to Israel in the neighborhood where asylum seekers live. It's the question of fear. So many political actors raise the issue that, as in this quote, people who live in this neighborhood with asylum seekers are afraid. They're afraid to go back to their house. They're threatened, they hurt, and they're afraid of anti-Semitic things that asylum seekers would say, as you can see in the quote. This narrative of fear is very present, especially in the far right of the political spectrum, but also in the Likud. And it was also very much channeled by the Minister of Interior, Eli Yishai. So, and it is, as you can see, very present in the neighborhood where the people live. Here, that's the picture of a demonstration against asylum seekers that basically brandishes all this rhetoric of fear and of asylum seekers bringing disease, crimes, and rapes in the neighborhood. So that's the first dimension that is probably not unique actually to Israel, and that you can probably see also in other cases in Europe or elsewhere. The second topic or theme and dimension of threat was the threat to economy. I think that is very typical as well. It's not proper to Israel. It's the idea that the asylum seekers or the migrants would be stealing jobs to Israeli workers, as you can see in this first and second quotes. The asylum seekers are taking the work of other Israeli citizens. And as you can see in the first quote, the fear is really that there will be a flood of migrant workers, so insisting on the fact that this is going to be a huge arrival of these people who are all going to basically steal the job of the migrant workers. This dimension is is more spread than the first one, in the sense that people from the center of the political spectrum also raise this issue. It's not only ultranationalists or right-wingers. Nevertheless, the third dimension was actually more important, the threat to national security. If you know a bit about Israel, you know how important national security is. And it's very interesting that almost at the very beginning of the arrival of asylum seekers, at the very beginning actually, there was a connection that was made between asylum seekers and national security. So in this quote, the Prime Minister Netanyahu, for instance, is talking about the wall that is being constructed between Egypt and Israel. And he says, we must also lay the infrastructure that will prevent the free movement of illegal infiltrators. We're going to erect a southern obstacle, as this issue is no less important for national security than the other things I mentioned. And this other thing he mentioned is in his speech are actually Iran, Hezbollah, and Hamas. So you can see the strong connection and the strong securitization that is made of the asylum seekers. They're not only coming to jeopardize the job market, but they are really a threat to national security. The use of the word infiltrator that you see here and that you could see also on the other dia is very important as well. The notion of infiltrator was first anchored in the prevention of infiltration law that was passed in the 50s to actually try to prevent Palestinians to come to Israel and to perpetuate attacks against Israel. And so, of course, using the same label for asylum seekers as the label that was used at the time for the Palestinian is very strong and also evokes a lot of fear. And what is even more interesting is that today this law on prevention of infiltration is actually the law that regulates the asylum seekers, because as I mentioned, now every person who crossed the border from Egypt is under the prevention of infiltration law and condemned to go to prison for 3 years. So today, it's not only political discourse to call these asylum seekers infiltrator, it is also a legal discourse. It's the legal label that you can use to talk about these people crossing the Egyptian border. So the last dimension of threats and of this discourse is the threat to national identity. So that's that also is quite specific to Israel, although to some extent. So here the question is really the idea that asylum seekers, because they are coming in flood, as you could see in the other quotes, because they're so numerous, they will actually jeopardize the character of the state, its identity, and undermine its identity as a Jewish and democratic state. But of course, as you can see, it's more the question of Jewish than democratic that is the problem. It's not because of course the number, the demographic balance is about the Jewish character of the state, not its democratic pattern. So, what does it produce as a discourse? What are the discursive consequences of this narrative? So first, as I mentioned, it securitizes the other. So asylum seekers in Israel are not seen as a human question. It is a human right question. It is a question of security and national security. It is a question of threat that Israelis have to face. By doing that, the discourse also dismantles or undermines the idea of the category of refugee at all. As in this quote that you can see from the Minister of Interior, First of all, let me be clear, we're not talking of refugees, we're talking of labor infiltrator. This label labor infiltrator, is also very interesting. It's actually a neologism that mixes the notion of infiltrator with the notion of labor, workers. And it's become pretty common also in the dominant discourse to use this label. So in these two words, you can really actually synthesize all the dimension of threat. The last consequence, of course, is constructing them, the asylum seekers, as a whole group without distinction and as a unified category that threaten us. The political consequences are what I told about, what I evoked in the beginning. The law on infiltration, which put in jail these people crossing the border, expulsion, and of course also the reinforcement of the borders. That is not only physical but also symbolic, as I mentioned. So what about? So that's the fence at the border that they are now building. What about the marginal discourse that is opposing this ideology, or this narrative, and these practices? So this discourse is articulated by Zionist left and far left parties, or member of the Knesset, and it opposes completely the current policies. It asks for asylum seekers to be granted the status of refugee, to be able to work in Israel, and to have at least temporary protection in Israel. It is basically a discourse of human suffering. It is also a very interesting discourse, and quite unique, I suppose. It's first a discourse that links human suffering with international law. So, as in these quotes from M.K. Khanin, you can see that what is at stake is people coming from horrible situations, from horrible places, where there have been genocide and murderous regime. Because of this, the State of Israel has a duty in terms of international law to protect these people and to give them shelter. So that's the first dimension that is present in the discourse. It's to connect the human suffering and recognizing the experience, the horrible experience of these people, and to acknowledge them the status of refugee. And that's a small part of the discourse, actually. The most important part of the discourse is really this one, which links human suffering of the asylum seekers to the history of the Jewish people. It's in the political arena, at least, and it's not the case in NGOs, but in the political arena, it's really the one that is most important. So like in the first quote, have we forgotten that we were refugees? So connecting our suffering, our experience as Jews with their suffering. And it is this connection that actually justifies the second obligation, the obligation to accept these people, like in the second quote. I am myself the daughter of a Holocaust survivor. We have not only the duty, but also a profound moral obligation as a people to give shelter to refugees. So I think that this part of the discourse is really interesting and probably different than what you can find in other states. And what is interesting too is that suffering is the ground of legitimacy, which is usually, I guess, the case when we talk about asylum seekers. But what is less expected is that this produces a kind of hierarchy of suffering. So if you look at the political discourse, it becomes who is the one who suffers, and is the migrant worker really suffering? No, it's not. He's not, but the asylum seeker is. So he is entitled to stay. The migrant worker is not entitled to stay because he's not suffering. So it creates a kind of a strange discourse in the Knesset. The second interesting and paradoxical, maybe, consequence of this discourse is really that it recreates the idea that Israel is the state of the Jewish people. It's always the we who are speaking, the we as Jewish, and because we are Jew, we should entitle these refugees to have a shelter in our home. It is, of course, important to underline that I found that because Palestinian member of the Knesset did not raise their voice. So it's also something interesting that I should probably get deeper into. But nevertheless, this is the impact that it has. The us is Jewish. So in conclusion, it's very partial because it's the first step of this analysis. But the arrival of the other, it clearly hasn't been hasn't changed the regime of citizenship, hasn't changed the conception of citizenship in Israel, contrarily to what some scholars actually claim. The dominant discourse has been a discourse of threat that has excluded the other from the polity. And the marginal discourse, paradoxically, while it's much more open in terms of accepting the other, has also reinforced the notion that the state of Israel is a Jewish state, hence actually reinforcing also the internal boundary between Jews and the Palestinian. So, yeah, that's what I have today, and I'll be happy to have your comments. Thank you.